Let's add a little bit more detail to how climate change cascades as multiple stressor into direct and indirect effects on human health. Climate-related stressors, we already mentioned: heat, drought, fire, pollution, pollen, sea level rise, extreme weather events, vector-borne diseases, and algal blooms. We will look at the details of each, as I mentioned. So the climate-related causes associated with those tend to be overall warming, shifts in rainfall patterns, which come in terms of direct effects of droughts plus nutrition effect, for example, and displacement effects because of droughts. Shifts in rainfall patterns related to fire, so fire affects pollution directly and also many indirect effects. Increased weed pollen, so CO2 levels and warming favor certain species which compete better in adverse conditions. Sea level rise coming from Antarctica and Greenland glacier melts, which raise sea level everywhere. There is more than 100 meters of sea level locked up in these glaciers, so that's melting pretty fast in some places. Antarctica is a bit complicated, but nonetheless, many glaciers over Antarctica are melting. Increased atmospheric energy because of warming of the oceans and supplying moisture produces extreme rainfall events and weather events, more intense cyclones, hurricanes, typhoons, longer durations, slower moving, so dumping more rainfall. Overall warming shifts in rainfall patterns, which affects populations of vectors like mosquitoes and also their habitats with warming. For example, a mountain freezing line may have been up to 1 kilometer beyond which mosquitoes were not present before, a few decades ago, but the warming has moved their line up into the higher altitudes. So if you're living happily in a place like Burkina Faso or so, then you have now more mosquitoes and more mosquito-borne diseases. So they are latitudinally expanding as well as altitudinally expanding. Then overall warming and runoff from heavy rains, more agriculture, more urbanization is affecting harmful algal blooms in coastal waters and lakes, by the way. The secondary effects, of course, include extreme heat days, ozone smog, reduced work capacity, reduced agricultural yield, crop yield losses, and food scarcity, which again has disproportionate impacts. We always have to worry about disproportionate impacts of all these things, right? Smoke from wildfires, particulate matters, property damage, and coastal flooding from sea level rise, coastal and river flooding, drinking water problems caused by flooding, contamination, mold, mosquito and tick-borne populations, marine mammals and bird die-offs, fisheries contamination and loss. Okay, the health effects: heat-related illness, respiratory illness, economic stress, malnutrition, population displacement, deaths, mental health effects, worsened allergies and asthma, drownings, diarrheal diseases, skin diseases, chemical contamination of food and water, fish contaminated, for example, chemical contamination, malaria, dengue fever, Zika, Chikungunya, Lyme disease, and other emerging diseases like COVID, not directly related yet to climate change, but indirectly related to the potentially increased contact between wildlife and humans, like bats and humans, and then mobility, making it easier for it to spread fast across the globe. So it's related in indirect ways. Diarrheal, neurological diseases, economic stress, and malnutrition. Okay, this is showing an animation starting in 2019 and going into 2050 and 2080. So future projections of how mosquito number of months per year when disease transmission from Aedes aegypti mosquito is possible. So you can see that the winter months in the boreal winter months like January, February, March is also becoming favorable at higher and higher latitudes into the future decades for mosquito-borne diseases. Of course, the global south and the deep tropics are already quite vulnerable to them, but with warming and extreme rainfall, this is going to become, and sea level rise, they are going to become hotspots as well. But they are pretty much susceptible throughout the year. But mountain regions like the Himalayas, the East African mountains, and the mountain ranges all over the place do become more susceptible for year-long mosquito-borne diseases. So that's not fun. Okay, so let me stop here and come to the what has already been happening in terms of spreading of the diseases. I mentioned chikungunya and Lyme disease, for example. How did chikungunya spread into Europe? Right? Is that related to climate change or human movement? Turns out both, as migration seeking employment and better life into cooler climates from regions that are warming, like in the deep south, Africa and India and so on. The impacts are manifest there already in terms of food production losses, heat waves, diseases, poverty, and then when they move, they bring the diseases, but warming locally also makes the conditions favorable for the disease to become endemic and then transmit locally. Chikungunya is one of those cases. We'll see a nice map of that showing the spread. Okay, so the globalization of the economy is obviously good in many ways, but it also comes with many negative impacts when combined with climate change stressors, which is unavoidable. But COVID has exposed many rifts between, let's say, China and the rest of the world. But in the coming years, the question is, how will economy again tempt people to forget about COVID? Right? In 10 years, 20 years, it's possible we would have completely forgotten COVID, because the Spanish flu which happened in 1918 and killed maybe 50 to 100 million people is now not remembered much at all. Right? So it's a question of how long it takes for a system to forget.